Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on Excitable Eaters. I'm Dr. Shelli Dry from Enable My Child. And tonight we are going to talk about ways to help your children learn to eat and enjoy eating. So let's look at our objectives for tonight. We want to explore all the sensations that play a role in eating. It's not just the taste of food, but everything that goes along with it that affects a child's ability to eat. We want to explore the strategies that can be used to promote eating development. And we want to discuss our strategies for picky eaters. After that, we'll take time for questions and answers. So let's look at all the systems that go into effect when you're learning how to eat. Of course, there's your respiratory system. Your first system and your first role in life is to be able to breathe. So if there's something going wrong with the respiratory system, it's difficult for people to eat. If you think about a time when you may have had a clogged nose or a cold, and you have a hard time chewing and breathing at the same time, you may eat less that day, or you may just choose to eat a lot slower, take time to breathe. We see that happen a lot in kids, that when they can't breathe, then they tend to eat less. Of course, there's the oral motor system, how you chew, how you move your tongue in your mouth, how you move food back to the back of the throat for swallow. And then anxiety, the system of being able to control stress and anxiety plays a role in eating. Those children that get so anxious when they even hear about food become overwhelmed by their anxiety, and they can't focus on what they are doing and engage in eating, and they can't take pleasure in it. The sensory system we're going to talk a lot about, and all the different sensations that play a role in eating. And of course, there's the motor control system. You have to be able to control your motor actions. You have to be able to chew effectively. You have to be able to bring food to your mouth effectively in order to eat. And of course, positions. So important. It's an area that's overlooked a lot. When children have difficulty sitting up and attending to the food in front of them, they have a hard time eating. Also, a child with lower muscle tone may be fighting that tone so much they can't focus on eating. So we need to support them. We need to use some of those strategies that I'll show you later, but also if you need to talk to a specialist who can help you develop some of those strategies to help a child sit upright, it would be very effective. And of course, nutrition plays another very large role. So let's look at that positioning that we talked about a minute ago. There's key areas you want to explore when you're looking at your child's position. First of all, are their hips well supported? Are they sitting and spreading that weight between their tailbone and the back of their thigh? They should be sitting more upright and really supported in the hips. You could do things like put little towel rows beside the hips if the child tends to lean to one side or the other. And that will help them get more in the middle. You want them sitting well on their hips, and you want them sitting well on their bottom, and then sitting more in the middle. And then feet. That's an area that people forget. Supporting the feet brings postural control to the body. So if you look at your booster chairs, your child you want to have a little bit of the chair here for them to be able to put their feet flat on the chair. When children start to slide their feet forward, then they throw themselves backwards, and then they start to end up slouching. So let's keep those feet supported. This booster chair is sometimes a little bit difficult to get the feet supported because it sits a little bit higher up. You can always put a block under there or a book or something like that. Get those feet well supported. And then the arms. You don't want your child to have to be reaching like this. You need to make sure the tray is adjusted so they can use their arms effectively to be able to get the food, pick it up, and bring it to their mouth. They should have the food in a good arm's length so that they're not having to reach way across, and they're not having to reach way up to get to their food. And of course, you want their vision well supported. You want them to be able to see what's in front of them. And you can do things if your child has trouble bringing things to the foreground, you can do things like put a nice colorful placemat underneath the food just to kind of bring that visual attention towards the food so that they can pick it up and bring it to their mouth. I'm going to go briefly over the development of eating. I know this is for 2-year-olds and up. So let's just look at what happens though when we're first learning how to eat. About 6 months, your child starts with purees. They are learning to slurp the food off the spoon, and they're learning to control it in their mouth, but they're also getting all that sensory input from something wet coming into their mouth. So starting with purees helps them develop tongue control, but it also helps them develop and tolerate some of those sensations that come with eating. And then we start to thicken the food a little bit, and we start to introduce cup drinking. We're not taking them off the bottle at this point, but we're just kind of putting that cup up to their mouth, helping them learn how to bring their cup to their mouth and helping them learn how to take drinks rather than just suckling a nipple. You add in some soft mash foods and you start to move towards table food. And you need to do this a little bit early. You can move towards that table food as long as it's processed in a way that the child can tolerate it. So we're not going to give them big chunks of meat. They're not ready to chew that yet, but we're going to give them more meltable foods. You can start with the soft mashed foods and move on to those meltable hard solids. Things like Cheetos are really good because they dissolve really easily for children, but you can also place them over in the area where those molars are going to develop. Of course, at 9 months, they don't have molars yet, or most children don't, but you put it right over there, hold the Cheeto over there so they can practice that up and down crunching, and you can feel confident that the food's going to melt in their mouth. The Gerber Crunchers are another good strategy for that. And with Cheetos, I was talking about those soft ones, easy to melt. And then you can start moving towards soft cubed foods. You've worked on their chewing, you start moving forward now and continue to progress their foods gradually. You want to just enhance the challenge just a little bit so that they feel successful. When your child feels successful with eating, they're more likely to explore different foods. And then you start to add in those single texture foods. You can start to bring in pasta and maybe muffins without a lot of blueberries or some of those additives, not the raisins, things that are easy to eat, simple muffins. And maybe try some scrambled eggs at 11 months or so. And then bring in more mixed textures because between 12 and 14 months, you want them completely on table food. Start the table food, a little bit earlier, and you gradually progress it. And then by 12 to 14 months, they should be completely on table food. They're continuing to explore and develop and strengthen those oral motor skills. They're learning how to move their tongue. They're moving towards foods that are a little bit harder to crunch and chew. But we need to go through this progression and help them. So as their skills develop, we also want to look at all the textures and sensations. Now, I mentioned a little bit puree. It's cold and wet a lot of times. Sometimes you warm it up and then it's warm and moist. And you want the children to explore those different textures and those different temperatures. But puree's a little bit bland. There's not a lot of odor, and kids can usually tolerate that pretty well. Every baby that I know of, their first bite, they kind of react to it. That's not a concern to me. It's not a concern when they push it out a little bit with their tongue. They don't have that control developed, and you're giving them something new. The key is to let them continue to explore those purees and eventually add in those other textures. So let's look at crunchy food. If you have crunchy food, you have a lot of jaw movement. You also have that movement that comes into that jaw joint that kind of increases awareness. And you can also add in a little variation in taste. So if we think about some of our crunchy food, it may be salty, or it may be something that's a little bit sweeter and crunchy, like a soft cookie. The other thing that you need to consider with crunchy food is how it scatters across the tongue. This is an area that's difficult for a lot of our children. When food scatters across their tongue and they don't know how to gather it back up, then they become a little scared, a little afraid, and they start to push that food away. If that happens, we just back up. We take it a little bit easier. We can give some of those meshed feeders or the silicone feeders, which I like a lot better, to help them control that scatter a little bit while they practice, and then try it with outside of the feeder again. And it's just this back and forth progress that we make as we're teaching children to tolerate textures and sensations. So we look at all these different areas of eating and we think about all the different sensations and all the different textures that are in food. We need to make sure that we're working within the child's ability and level. So if you look at chewy food, that is a lot more difficult. So now they're not only having textures that change because as you chew it, it starts to become moist and it's no longer a chewy texture. It's starting to break apart in your mouth and it's becoming a different, maybe a little bit more slimy. So we have changes in textures. And then we have these different smells and tastes. Again, we need to look at all those sensory aspects of food and why a certain food is harder than another for a child. And our fibrous foods, some kids just do fantastic with that. They love celery. They love things that are fibrous because they get that crunch and they can tolerate that texture. And then other children, they just don't know how to break it down. They don't have the strength to chew it, and they don't like the way it feels in their mouth. So we just need to work with them, work very gradually, and slowly add in different textures and tastes. Now, people get concerned about 2 years old, 1.5 to 2 years old, when children start to eat less. That is a typical developmental stage, though. They're not growing near as fast. As a baby, they're growing so much quicker and they need a lot of food, and it seems like they eat a lot more. They're not eating a lot more calories. They're getting it through formula or through breast milk, but they are growing more rapidly and they're burning through that food faster, so they're eating more frequently. It is typical for a child to start lengthening the time between food, and by 2 years old, they also get that little bit of pickiness that starts to kick in. That again is a developmental stage. It's not something we get concerned about if they've been a good eater beforehand. If your child's had problems eating, then we want to do what we can to prevent some of that pickiness by helping them eat more of their preferred foods and just keep that schedule of meal times going. We're also working on weaning from bottle to cup, and we're starting self-feeding around this age, and we're working on getting our children to imitate us and imitate their siblings. Their taste buds are becoming more acute, and they're starting to learn what kind of foods they like and what kinds they do not like. One of the things between 1 and 2 years old is that we want them to be touching and exploring foods. This, again, is a developmental stage and it's crucial to eating. Children should be able to feel the food if they're a little worried about putting it in their mouth and explore it that way before they have to take bites. And then as they age and they become 2 to 3 years old, then we notice that their muscle control is a lot better. They're chewing much better, and they can start moving towards some of those harder to eat meats. They're also using their spoon and fork pretty well, and their mature chewing continues to develop and integrate into a pattern for them. They accept more variety, and a lot of times at this age, they really want that sweeter food. Remember, their taste buds have become more acute, and sweet food tastes pretty good to them. And then at 4 to 5 years old, we see that pickiness can start to come back in, and kids may develop some of those food jags. Again, those things are normal. But what do we do when the children can't eat? or they are stuck on one texture or one type of food. One of the things we really want to make sure we're looking at is how to make our meals less stressful for that child. When the child is so anxious that they can't even think about food, they're not going to eat very well. So let's bring that anxiety down. Now we can do that in multiple ways. We can alter the environment. We can make the lights a little bit dimmer. We can make sure that they're in a nice quiet area when they're eating so they can focus more on food. Of course, we want to use those positioning techniques so they're not fighting their body, that they can see their food well. We also want to make sure that we give them a little bit of warning before it's a mealtime. And those children who are anxious do very well with a schedule. And they do really well with those scheduled meals. You want to approach a meal as matter of fact. Don't pressure your child to eat, but just, this is what we do at 12 o'clock every day. We have lunch and we're going to sit down at the table and we're going to eat together and have a little bit of lunch. And you're going to enjoy your food. And, you can prompt your child once in a while to eat. That's fine. Just try not to do some of those games where you're really working on how much they eat. Take that focus and that pressure away from them. We want our eating to be pleasant. And if it's hard for the child, remember that they may need a little bit more time. So give them longer to eat their meals. Take a slower start to meals. Use all those things like washing your hands beforehand. Use that same pattern and routine to get them ready for meals. It helps them wrap their mind around the fact that they're going to eat, and eating's always difficult for them. So you make it a little bit easier by taking a slower approach to eating. You don't expect them to start eating right away. You just kind of bring stuff out to them and sit down with them. And then do those environmental modifications for them. Make the room as pleasant as possible. And you also want to use those highly preferred foods. It's good to start your child with something they enjoy because you want them to start eating, and then you can introduce some of those novel foods. The other thing is to give your child a little bit of power over the size of the bites that they're taking. If they want to take little nibbles, that's fine. In fact, I make it a game. I'm like, oh, we're just going to have little nibbles. We're going to nibble like a mouse today. And just make it fun and give them the power to decide what size of serving they have and what size of bite they want to take. So let's look now at some of the key points. One of the things that you'll hear a lot from feeding experts is that division of responsibility. And that's simply that you can give your child, make them the best meals. They can be delicious to you. You think you've got everything, all the points hit that they love, but they still don't eat. Well, we can't force them to eat. So your responsibility is to prepare the food you want them to have. And I'd like to prepare food that I know they will have. And then their job is to eat. Another key point is to avoid those food jags. Now, I told you those come around 4 to 5. That's typical, but we don't want children to get stuck with the same food every day. We don't even want to give them the same brand every day. So you need to kind of alter your foods, alter the brand so that it does not become the only thing they eat. When a child experiences a food jag, they'll eat that same food multiple days, but then they'll kind of put their hands up. They're done with it. And so you don't want to lose a food that they've been enjoying in the past. You can offer your meals on a schedule. And another key area to look at is how much are they grazing in between meals or even drinking a lot of milk. If a child drinks a lot of milk too close to a meal, they're going to fill themselves up. And that makes it easy for them to avoid some of the more difficult things like eating. You want to create bridges of familiarity. So I like to do that through food chaining. I've talked about not using the same brand, but I did not talk about ways to chain the food. Food chaining is a technique where you take a food that a child likes and you alter it just slightly. I like to alter just one aspect of the food. So if they're very good with macaroni and cheese, but they'll only eat Kraft macaroni and cheese, you might want to try Kraft white cheddar. Or you might want to take the macaroni and change from macaroni to some of those little shapes. Just alter one aspect at a time. And the idea is to continually expand beyond macaroni and cheese. We don't want them to eat macaroni and cheese at every meal. We don't want that to be the only food they eat. We don't want that to be the only type of pasta. We want them to be able to explore multiple types. The key with food chaining is change one aspect at a time, and to always try to think of what else you can do with that same type of food. We're going to talk about the SOS approach to eating, and they explore if a child likes stick foods, then you give all stick foods, but you give stick foods of different types. That's another great way to get food exploration in. You can consider good role models and helping a child learn to eat from their peers, if that's possible, but also from their siblings. And I've had such success with siblings who come up and the child may not be eating much, and the sibling will sit down and take a bite, and then they'll just offer the same thing to their brother or sister, and the baby starts eating. And it's so nice how siblings can work so well with each other and start to do things for each other. So having their siblings at meals is a great way, or they're good friends. And again, we're going to encourage exploration, and we're going to keep those food portions small. We can always give a child more, but we can take away. But if we overwhelm them with a large plate of food, we can turn them off of eating at that meal. Another thing I like to do are those creative environments. So one thing, of course, we've talked about being patient, consistent, and one thing I usually key parents in is make sure that you're approaching each meal as a new meal. When you have a baby who has a hard time eating, you become stressed around food. So you need to make sure that you're not stressed, and each meal is a new meal, and you go in there with a lot of patience, and you have a lot of consistency in your approach to eating. Have small expectations of your baby. Don't explore multiple new foods at one time, and make the foods their preferred foods, and then just bring in a very small amount. The idea is not to introduce a whole new diet, but just introduce one aspect of a food that you would like them to eat. Look at their sensory system, decide what works for them, and that could be taste, it can be texture, it can also be, what's going on. Do they need to get up and move around before they eat? Before they come to the table, do they do better if they engage in obstacle course play or dancing and kind of alert their sensory system? Then try to do that before a meal. Again, when you're thinking about sensory systems and making food sensory friendly, you need to even do that preparatory activities before the meal. And if they're always tired when they're getting ready to eat, then you need to get them awake and get their sensory system alerted and ready to engage. And of course, we want the children to have positive experiences when they're trying new foods. So we want to make the food as pleasant as we can. You can do things like those sandwich cutters and making shapes out of food. Some children like their crust cut off. A lot of children like their crust cut off. And some of them like triangles, make their sandwiches into triangles or make it into a different shape, cut it into a circle. We talked about doing all stick foods. Just try to become creative with their food and use kid-friendly foods. And then distraction-free. Try to make it mealtime, focused on mealtime. Take away the TV. You don't need to use the iPad if you can help it. It's better to just introduce a distraction-free meal that's focused on eating. So let's talk a little bit about the sequential oral sensory approach to eating. That's one of the treatment types that work very well with those children who are extremely picky and who have a lot of sensory differences and have a hard time changing sensory routines to engage in eating. So if you think about the sensory system in eating, you know that there's the smells, there's the taste, the texture, there's the way food sounds when you chew it. There's also the way food looks when you're looking at it. The sequential oral sensory approach takes all that into consideration. And when they developed this approach, they looked at the multiple steps to eating. It's not just pick up a bite and bring it to your mouth. For a child with an eating difference, somebody who is very picky or has problems eating, then we need to start the first step with exploration. So that can be, it can be made into a game. And in the SOS approach, they do suggest you do things like put it in a container and kind of look at it and talk about it first and build up to showing the food to your child. So you want to get them excited about the new food. This is done outside of a meal. I thought I better mention that. It's done more like snack time or something like that when you're introducing these new foods. So say you're going to bring out carrots, then you might want to put them in a bowl. You can do the stick carrots, you can do the shredded carrots or the little mini carrots. Put them in a bowl and you just kind of lift the lid and say, ooh, guess what I have? These are orange in color. And then you just talk it up for your child. You want to start that exploration, start getting them interested in the food. Another thing they tell us in the SOS approach to eating is to organize food around themes. So we talked about stick foods, but also maybe doing all fruits for snack one day or all red foods for snack one day. And you just kind of pick a theme and organize the food that you're going to explore in that thing. Now, I always tell parents 3 foods is the max you want to do in food exploration. So you don't want to become overwhelming. Just stay with 3 foods. And again, try to make it within the textures that they like, and then just bring 1 new food in that's a different texture. Keep it fun and keep it simple. We want to make our children excited about eating. So we're going to make those new foods exciting, but we're going to also use that approach when we're developing excitement in ourselves to help them develop excitement about the foods. And then using mealtime routines. So one of the things I like to do is try to start every meal with washing your hands. It's what you normally do before you eat. So start the same routine the same way each time. Again, I've talked a lot about putting those preferred foods in. I like to do a 2-to-1, 2 preferred foods to 1 new food. So start with those preferred foods. You want to get them into the routine and the habit of eating. Encourage dipping. So you can do a lot with dipping. You can take, if your child only eats crackers, if you can just get them to dip that cracker in tomato soup. And it may just be the very tip of the cracker that gets dipped in the soup. But you're working on dipping because dipping is fun and it helps them explore new foods. And kids can usually, if they can just dip a little tiny bit, then they can start to decide if they like this novel food. Offer drinks throughout the meal. A lot of times, giving them a drink of water just kind of refreshes the mouth, and it gives them a break from this difficult aspect of eating. And then you can give verbal warnings if you're going to, if they have a hard time with eating, and say, oh, I'm getting ready to prepare lunch. Or if they have a hard time with smells, there's going to be some big smells today. I use big and little with kids when I'm exploring the food, especially in that sequential oral sensory approach. It's like you pick up a food and you say, whoa, this has a big taste. And it may be something that's really strong, or it may be something that's spicy, but I just use words that they're used to hearing. So I use big and little a lot, loud or soft, words that are familiar to them, but I give them that verbal warning of, if I take a taste of it, oh, wow, this is a crunchy food today. Just letting them know what they're getting ready to taste. And then I like to do a cleanup routine after the meal. So another approach to eating is called the treat model. Now, this is a transdisciplinary approach to eating. And it was developed by a psychologist and I believe an occupational therapist. And they talk about using that multidisciplinary approach where you also want to bring in the speech therapy and see what their input is into eating. But you take this nice multidisciplinary approach, and it is a behavioral approach where you're working with a child on learning new foods. It does work with children with sensory differences, but it only works then if the foods that are introduced are kind of introduced around their sensory abilities. In the treat model, you will take your plate and you will have the plate on the side. So the child sitting in front of you, they don't have their food in front of them. You're controlling the food. And you have food in each section of the plate, and you introduce the food with the one food towards them that you want them to eat. And they get one bite. And then you take the plate away and you give them a preferred activity. Again, I said this is the behavioral approach, and this is the behavioral model of reinforcing. So you give them something to do that they prefer while you prepare their next food. And you rotate the plate and put it in front of them again. You allow them to take a bite, take the plate away, and give them back their preferred activity while you're cutting and getting their next bite prepared. And you can preload the fork, you can preload the spoon. The idea is that bite at a time, take the plate away, give them a preferred thing. Now that can be bubble play, it can be, I've used water play a lot, kids who like water, but it's just this in and out of food. It takes away some of the stress of having the food completely in front of them, and it does work well with a lot of children. The developers of the model did say, though, a lot of times their model is not for everyone. So it is a model that if they feel like that child needs to do that exploration with their hands and all the different sensory aspects, they will recommend that the child goes to see somebody who does more of a sequential oral sensory approach. The treat model works really well with picky eaters. Again, you're using those highly preferred foods and you're looking at just teaching them each aspect of eating one step at a time. So let's look at how we can make food creative for kids. We want to try to serve our foods as a family and always include at least one preferred food. Now, I like to, when I'm starting out with a meal, then I always include 2 preferred foods and 1 novel food. But as you progress, you still want to consider that they've got to have something that's highly preferred on their plate. If the child wants larger portions of their preferred food and smaller portions of the novel food, that's okay. We want to let them start to take a little bit of control as they progress in their eating. A lot of children prefer the divider plates. They don't want their food touching, and they don't want the juices running together. So it doesn't hurt anything to give them a divider plate, so let's use that divider plate to help keep those foods separate. And then give them the power of eating through choices and through that division of responsibility. Some of the game changers. Food chaining really is a great technique. You can move from eating something like yogurt to eating a multiple different varieties of taste as you go through and explore all the yogurts, but then you can move towards eating soup. You're using that same texture and you're just changing the food a little bit at a time. So with food changing, again, we want to change one item or aspect at a time. We start with a preferred food, and then we add in those non-preferred foods in smaller portions. We can use water between meals rather than filling them up with milk. And we want to make sure we're always tailoring things to our own individual child. So children are individuals. No one technique works for every child. And a lot of times, as a feeding expert, I will use a multitude of techniques with one child, just not all at once. So we may change the strategies as the child progresses. They may start out requiring sequential oral sensory and food chaining, and then we may be able to bring in the treat model if we need to work on just the aspects of eating and the behavior of eating. So let's look a little bit at how we can prepare the way for those novel foods. We can always work on exploring foods outside of meals and outside of snacks. I like some of those very realistic foods now they have. So I like to get play food and do some play with them, but also exploring the different dishes, leaving bowls and spoons out so that they can pretend to feed their baby dolls. And then also putting cups out and leaving different cups around the room if they have that difficulty of transitioning from bottle to cup. Visiting places. So I've had one family who their child really had a hard time with smells, and she could not tolerate all the different smells mixing together with foods. So mom would take her to the Yankee Candle store, and they would explore some of those food smells that Yankee Candle has out. Again, they would do maybe 3 or 4 and then be done for that day, but they would just go in, and 3 or 4 times a week they would go explore food smells through candles. Another family went and visited an orchard because they were trying to work on eating fruits. And so they went to the orchard and they were able to pick their own fruits, and the child was able to take more interest in what the fruits looked like and how they developed on the vine when they were looking at strawberries. And, it became a little bit more fun for the child, and they were able to explore that food themselves then later on. Exploring various bakeries or places with strong smells is another good way. I talked about the Yankee Candle store, but you can also take your child into a bakery because there's a lot of different smells there. Um, I like to tell kids, what kind of smells they're gonna smell, or what kind of things if a food has a very strong smell, telling them about it beforehand. But also exploring those strong food smells away from food is a great way to promote eating. And then we talked about play foods already, but also creating jewelry or projects with foods. Now, you can make those Cheerio necklaces. I think a lot of kids are used to that, but also potato painting, things like that, so that they're learning to touch the food and get used to the food without being expected to eat it. It's those basic little tiny steps that get them towards eating, which helps children then expand and explore their foods during meals. So let's go back to the sequential oral sensory approach, and I want to go through some of the steps in eating. I talked to you about how many steps she has. This is not all of them. When this approach was developed, then Dr. K looked at all the different aspects of eating. And I've narrowed it down some, but if you think about it, first thing that the child has to do is tolerate that food, even being in the room with them. And these are children who are very selective eaters. And then they need to tolerate the food on the table, but not close to them, just allow it to be on the table. And then you start to move the food closer, and then they tolerate it on the plate, and they start to touch it with utensils and maybe with one finger and then their whole hand. And then they get towards manipulation of food, putting it in their hands, being able to smell it, being able to touch it to their lips, being able to lick their lips after food has touched it, holding food on their lips, and then bringing it to their teeth, licking the food, and then finally putting food in their mouth, and eventually chewing and swallowing. We don't start with tolerates food in room if the child's already at food exploration, though. If they're manipulating food, then that's our starting point. So if they're able to do this step over here with placing food in their hands, we consider that they can do all these other steps on the way to development. Another key point about the steps to eating is that you can go through some of these very quickly, but then you may get stuck. So if they're able to do all of these steps, but they can't bring the food to their nose to smell it, then we might just go back a step about them putting it in their hands, touching it, and letting the smells come naturally. It's a progression that helps when you look at the sensory system and how overwhelming just one aspect of the sensory system can overwhelm other aspects of the sensory system and then overwhelm the skill of eating. Now, these are some tips and strategies that help. It's a lot of stuff that I've already been talking about, but the first thing we want to do is look at those pleasurable mouth experiences. So we can do that in many different ways. I like to do that through play and just even having the child be able to blow whistles, have a lot of different blow bubbles, a lot of different silly noises, but making those experiences pleasurable to them. Another area that you want to look at is developing those positive mealtime relationships. So you can practice socialization outside of a mealtime and allow the child to experience all the aspects of food outside of a mealtime in order to make that mealtime relationship a lot more positive. Decrease in external stimulation we've talked about extensively, so I'm not going to go into that too much. Using a positive and loving touch throughout the day to help develop trust and promote desensitization. So if we have a child who is very sensitive to eating or to the way food feels in their mouth, we not only work with that sensation during the meal, but we need to also work with that sensation and tolerance to that sensation outside the meal. You can do that through multiple ways. You can do deep pressure massage. You can have them put lotion on themselves, on their arms, and then eventually on their face and work on the external aspect of sensation. You can also use a vibrating toothbrush, which is a lot of times easier to tolerate for kids. So that's one way to get that positive and loving touch through a natural activity like brushing your teeth. You want to make sure you're following your child's lead during oral care. Jumped ahead too fast. And then if we have a child who is only fed through a G-tube, then we want to make sure we're also providing oral stimulation during those G-tube feedings. So we need to make sure that we are, when they're having their tube feeding, we're giving them things to explore with their mouth. It can be a pacifier to suck on. It can be a vibrating toothbrush. they can be working on hands to mouth using their own hands. And if their swallow is safe, they can work on suckers and popsicles, eating at the same time they're getting their G-tube feed. As they progress through those eatings, then they learn that the mouth is what helps them feel full, not just the food going into their belly. And then achieving stability is another area that's key to developing eating skills. So I've talked a lot about different aspects of eating and how to make our eating stress-free, using those low-stress meals, focusing more on increasing intake of preferred foods rather than the novel foods. We really want to avoid counting calories. It's really difficult. As a parent, you know that your child has to have food going in, and there's a lot of focus on how much they've eaten and what types of calories. But if you can avoid counting calories and focus on the quality of their eating, then you're doing yourself a favor. Again, creating that pleasant and unhurried environment and using dry runs, and then exploring food outside of meal times, during snack or during playtime, and then also using all those fun utensils and dishes, things like that, if that's what your child enjoys. So I told you I want to leave time for questions. I've had several questions sent in. The first one was on a 2-year-old. The mom said they show no interest in food, and when she feeds him, he won't close his mouth. He's on pureed foods only at 2 years old because he won't chew his food. Now, my first guess for this child is that he's one of those children who doesn't like food to scatter on his tongue. The mouth has a lot of sensory input in it, and the tongue is particularly difficult when children don't like the way food scatters. So we're not going to get him to just take bites of food, and we're not going to get him to start chewing just because he's at the right age to chew. So what we want to do while mom's feeding is work where he is. So right now, he doesn't have a lot of interest in food. He won't close his mouth. So we want to think about the sequential oral sensory approach. Make the food more interesting. He's on puree, so we're going to start with puree. We're going to take a lot of variety in our puree, and we're going to use food chaining to change that puree a little bit at a time to help the little one eat. But we also want to work on mouth closure and being able to enjoy eating. So you start with putting the food in different containers and with lids on it so that he doesn't see the food right away, and then we have to really engage his interest. This is a child who would do well with that food schedule, coming to meals, having meals at about the same time each day, doing things like encouraging picnics and things like that, where there's a little bit of novelty to the meal, but it's still at the same time of the day. And then showing your own interest in the food and having him start to explore it just a little bit at a time. So you open the container a little bit and you play a guessing game with your child. And if they're not interested and they won't answer, then you just do it yourself. Oh, it's purple. What do you think is purple? I think it might be blueberry yogurt today. What do you think? Would you like to look? And then you just kind of peek a little bit. Oh, that's all. What do you think that food might feel like? Just try to get their interest in eating, but try to get their interest in the food before you even expect them to take a bite. Another thing that works well with these kids is just dipping the spoon. So we're not going to put another food in there that we know they can't handle because they haven't mastered purees yet. We're just going to dip the spoon, and then they can just bring it up and smell it. We're not expecting them to eat it. We're just, let's smell this food. Okay, now do you want to touch it to your lips? And as you continue making the eating less stressful and giving the child a little bit more control over eating, then you'll start to expand. It's not a quick fix. It's not something that happens very rapidly, but as a child becomes more comfortable, then you can start to explore more things and it picks up in speed. So the first things I would look at with your 2-year-old son is working on interest in food, and do that by making sure you're scheduling your meals. You're not giving him a lot of milk to fill up on. If he needs that food supplement, give it to him in the evening, early morning, away from meals, mid-afternoon. Just try to time your supplement so that it's not coming at the exact same time of eating or too close to eating. So you want to work on things when he's a little bit hungry. And then just work on interest and hopefully him bringing spoon to mouth himself, so that even if it's just a tiny bit dipped on a spoon, so that he's starting to close his lips naturally. Okay, our next question was about another 2-year-old. And this little guy will not drink from a cup, a sippy cup, a straw, or a bottle. So they've tried it all. So what do you think might be going on with this little 2-year-old? A lot of times it's not actually the cup, but it's tipping the head back. It may be the mechanics of how to bring cup to mouth, but a lot of children who only drink out of bottles, they lay back when they drink the bottle and they don't bring that head out of midline. So that's the first thing I would look at. Can they look up at the ceiling? Can they bring their head up and bring it out of midline? If they're not very good with that, then it's probably something vestibular, and you might want to try something like a nosy cup. Now, a nosy cup is a cutout cup. I have one right here. I'll show you all. So this has this edge right here is cut out. And the reason that is so that you can drink without bringing your head back. So you don't have to, when you're drinking normally, you kind of tip up. You don't have to bring that head out of midline. Nosy cups work well for kids who don't like to look up. But then the other thing is to work with an occupational therapist outside of meals and work on helping your child get a normalized vestibular system so that they're not always having a hard time moving their head in space. Okay, my next question was on a 2.5-year-old, and Mom said that she will not eat any meats. So the first question I would have for that is, how is the chewing going? Is this child able to use a diagonal pattern when they're chewing? Is their jaw moving in a diagonal pattern? Or is it moving in a rotary pattern? So if the jaw is moving at this angle, they're probably not grinding their food very well. The other thing, a lot of times you'll see kids who don't eat meats, their jaw's just going up and down, and that is more a munching pattern, and they're definitely not grinding meats. So there's different things you can do. First of all, you work on the chewing, of course. Chewing is a skill that is developed naturally as during food progression, but you can work on it by placing foods on the chewing, on the molars, and helping that child learn to chew. And you also want to work on the strength of chew. So you can do things like work with a chewy tube. Those are just those two. They're like teethers for a little bit older child. They're shaped like a T, or there's some shaped like a P or a Q, but they have that long stick for kids to work on chewing, and they're very resistant so that kids can strengthen their chew. With the chewy tube, sometimes you have to dip it in flavor, put a little peanut butter on it or something like that, dip it in pudding, whatever, to get them to chew a little bit longer. So that's one thing I look at is, are they chewing strong enough? Is their chewing mature? Are they using more of a rotary pattern to where they can grind the meat, or are they just using more of a munching or a diagonal pattern? The next thing that I would look at is what the bite size is. So you can always shred out meat, and that makes it a lot easier to eat. And then if the meat is too dry, you can put some moisture on it, like gravy or something like that. Again, you just have to start with where your child is and then move forward with their ability. If a child feels like they're going to choke on something, they're not going to eat it. And this question is about a 4-year-old. And the 4-year-old, mom said her child transitioned rapidly from puree to table food. And now he's a very picky eater and he hates textures of foods. And then she said, is it too late to change this? And will the strategies we've been discussing work for him? And most definitely these strategies would work. Now, again, transitioning rapidly, sometimes that happens where a child goes very quickly from puree to table food. I don't think that affected your child, but it is interesting to know that they may not have gone through those steps of oral motor development, and they may need to go back a little bit and work on tongue control, may need to work on chewing ability, and may need to work on how to move food to the back of your tongue to prepare for swallow. So there's a lot of steps in there that may have been skipped when they transitioned rapidly. And then, Mom, you said that your little one is a very picky eater because he hates textures of foods. And I would look at the sequential oral sensory approach. And you may want to call a specialist and get some help with this. Sequential oral sensory approach is not something I can teach you in just a few minutes. It's a course where you study it for several days in a row, and then you practice, and then you work with a mentor, and you become better and better at it. So it's something where you probably need somebody who specializes in that treatment approach to kind of guide you and teach you how to help your child expand his eating. And then the next question was from a mom whose child doesn't eat in the morning, but they're pretty good, she says, at lunch and at dinner time. Some kids are not awake in the morning. I would use some of those easy to eat foods. Make it a smoothie or something like that, and just get them into the habit of eating in the morning, or the habit of feeling food come in the morning. A lot of times you need to help alert their body to get them prepared for eating. They've gone all night without food, so you know that the hunger's there, but they may not be able to sit down and engage in the aspects of eating. They may be actually too hungry and need to do something like a smoothie, and then work on a little bit more of breakfast around a mid-morning snack. And our last question for tonight is about a 15-month-old who won't accept anything but puree foods. And that kind of goes back towards that first question with the 2-year-old who shows no interest. If your 15-month-old is stuck on purees, you definitely need to start with developing interest in food. And you also want to work on gradually adding in textures. Now, one of the things I do a lot with these younger babies, the 15-month-old age, 12 to 15-month-old, is if I'm trying to introduce crunchy food or a little bit of food that they might have to chew, I'll start with crumbling. And I might take crackers or something and get them into very, very fine crumbs so they can just kind of dip a finger in and lick it. And a lot of times that takes care of the children who don't like scatter on their tongue, or the children who just look at this food that they don't know how to manage and how to pick up and take a bite from, and it just kind of throws them into this pattern of, oh no, I'm not going to eat that at all. I'm only going to eat this puree food and nothing else. So crumbling food is a very good strategy. And then the other thing at 15 months old is you can start with those soft meltables like the Gerber Crunchers, or using those soft Cheetos, things like that, and work on dipping that into the puree so they're just licking it off of the cruncher. And then as that gets wet, it becomes a little bit, they get just a little bit of texture at a time, and doing this very gradual process. Our time is up for tonight. Thank you all for attending. I've enjoyed this, and I hope you learned enough to take away with you. If you need to look more at some of the aspects of eating, or if you need a little bit more help, you can always contact a professional. We have several people at Enable My Child who can help you, and a lot of feeding experts there. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.